before the arrival, a land of nations. Long before the arrival of Europeans, the land we now call North America was home to hundreds of indigenous nations. These were not primitive tribes, as history books once claimed, but complex, thriving societies, each with its own government, language, and culture. Some lived in long houses deep in the forests of the Northeast. Others built adobe homes in the hot deserts of the Southwest. Some followed the great herds of buffalo across the vast plains. Others carved totem poles along the coast of the Pacific Northwest. They were the Iroquois, the Lakota, the Apache, the Pueblo, the Choctaw, the Ojibwe, the Comanche, the Tlingit, and so many more. Each had sacred traditions, oral histories, and spiritual connections to the land. They fished in rivers, hunted in forests, and grew maize, beans, and squash in fertile valleys. They traded across thousands of miles without horses or wheels, guided by trust and relationships built over centuries. This was not an empty wilderness. It was a world full of life, wisdom, and balance. First contact, disease, greed, and conflict. When Europeans first arrived in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they encountered a land already known, already home. But for native peoples, contact brought devastation. With them, Europeans brought disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses the native peoples had never faced. Whole villages vanished. In some regions, 90% of the population died within just a few decades. And then came colonial expansion. The Spanish came for gold. The French came for fur. The English came for land. What followed were centuries of betrayal, violence, and resistance. Treaties were made and broken. Promises were given and taken back. Land was purchased through coercion, manipulation, or violence. Yet, through it all, native peoples fought to survive. The Trail of Tears, forced removal. In the 1800s, the U.S. government adopted a brutal policy of Indian removal. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced tribes to leave their homelands and relocate west of the Mississippi River. The most tragic result was a Trail of Tears, the forced march of the Cherokee Nation and other southeastern tribes from their ancestral lands. They walked over 1,000 miles through bitter cold and hunger. Children died. Elders collapsed. Entire families were torn apart. Over 4,000 Cherokee people perished along the way. They called it progress. But for the Cherokee, it was a death march. The Indian Wars, resistance on the plains. Even after removal, native peoples continued to resist. The Great Plains became the stage for some of the most intense battles between native nations and the U.S. military. The Lakota Sioux, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, fought bravely to defend their land and way of life. In 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, they defeated General Custer in one of the most famous victories in Native American history. But victory was short-lived. By the late 1800s, buffalo herds, the lifeblood of the plains, were slaughtered to near extinction. Without food, many tribes were forced onto reservations, often on barren, unwanted land. In 1890, the resistance ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Over 250 Lakota men, women, and children were killed by U.S. troops. Some were shot while fleeing, others while praying. The massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of Native armed resistance in the continental United States. Boarding schools, kill the Indian, save the man. With the wars over, a new strategy began: cultural erasure. The U.S. government opened Indian boarding schools across the country. Native children were taken from their families, often by force, and sent hundreds of miles away. At these schools, children were forbidden to speak their language, forced to cut their hair, punished for practicing their traditions, given new English names. The goal was to assimilate them, to strip away their identity and make them more American. But what they really lost was home, language, and self. Many children never returned. Those who did carried the pain for life. The Red Power movement, a new resistance. By the 20th century, Native Americans had been pushed to the margins of society. But in the 1960s and 70s, a new generation rose, proud, angry, and determined to reclaim their heritage. This was the Red Power movement. In 1969, Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island for 19 months, demanding recognition of broken treaties. In 1973, members of the American Indian Movement, AM, took over the town of Wounded Knee, standing against corruption and injustice. They spoke out in Washington, protested in front of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and demanded respect, land, and sovereignty. They shouted what had long been whispered. We are still here. Today, a living people. Today, there are over 5 million Native Americans in the United States. There are 574 federally recognized tribes, each with its own culture, government, and language. Native communities are reviving languages, teaching traditional skills, defending sacred lands, and fighting for justice. Native scientists, politicians, athletes, and artists are shaping the world while honoring the wisdom of their ancestors. But challenges remain. Poverty is still high. Access to health care and education is limited. Native women face disproportionately high rates of violence and disappearances. Sacred lands continue to be threatened by pipelines, mining, and urban development. And yet, the resilience continues. We are still here. The history of Native Americans is not only a story of tragedy, it is a story of survival. For more than 10,000 years, indigenous peoples have lived on this land. They have faced invasion, disease, betrayal, and silence. And still they endure. Through every drumbeat, every prayer, every language spoken once again, they remind us we are still here, not as a memory, not as a footnote, but as nations, as people, as the original keepers of this land.